daughter sat across from me, eyes steady, voice calm, and said, "Dad, you should sell your house and give us the money. Not lend it, not invest it. Give it," like I was handing over an old coat I no longer needed. She said it between sips of coffee, as if she were asking me to pass the sugar. The room didn't tilt, but something inside me did. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. Surely, Emily wasn't suggesting that the home I'd built with her mother, the same home she'd run through as a child, should be liquidated like some idle asset. But she sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching me as if she'd just delivered a perfectly reasonable proposal. It was a Sunday afternoon, the light streaming through the window in soft gold, catching dust motes in the air. A day meant for rest, for quiet, for maybe a shared laugh over something small. Instead, we were balanced on the edge of a precipice I hadn't seen coming. "This house," I said slowly, "isn't just walls and a roof. It's our history. That's exactly why it makes sense," she replied without missing a beat. "You don't need all this space anymore. Mark and I could use the money to finally get ahead. You've had your time here, Dad. Why not help us start fresh?" Her tone was light, but her words landed like stones. "You've had your time," as if the rest of my years were a slow fade-out. As if everything I had built and kept was now only valuable as fuel for someone else's fire. A dozen thoughts crashed into one another in my mind. I remembered the nights I stayed up with her when she was sick as a child. The extra shifts I worked to cover her college tuition without her ever knowing the strain it caused. I remembered co-signing the loan for her first apartment, paying for repairs on her car, covering medical bills when my grandson was born. None of those moments had been framed as sacrifices. They were acts of love, offered without question. But this was not a request for love. This was a demand for surrender. I watched her as she spoke about investing in their future, about how the timing couldn't be better, how real estate was in a good market for sellers. She spoke as though I were a distant business partner, not her father. Each word widened a gap between us that I hadn't realized was already forming. The air in the room grew heavier. My coffee sat cooling in front of me, untouched. I felt the weight of the walls around me, each one lined with decades of memories. Photographs from Emily's high school graduation, the handprints we'd pressed into wet cement when we built the back patio, the worn patch on the arm of the couch where my late wife used to rest her elbow while reading. She was asking me to erase all of that for a fresh start that wasn't mine. "Emily," I said carefully, "do you understand what you're asking?" "I do," she said, with the confidence of someone convinced they were right. "It's not about taking from you. It's about helping us all move forward." We'd make good use of it. Something in me flinched at the word helping. I had spent a lifetime helping. I had helped so much that I'd begun to forget what it felt like to hold something purely for myself. And now, my daughter was asking me to strip away the last of what was mine. I felt a heat rising under my collar, not anger exactly, but the dangerous pressure that comes when emotion has no safe release. I thought about telling her no outright, about standing and pointing to the door, about listing every sacrifice I'd ever made. But those words would have been born of pain, and pain tends to make a mess. So I swallowed them. "I'll think about it, I said instead. Her face softened, as if my measured reply was exactly the answer she'd hoped for. She stood, kissed my cheek, and left with a smile that carried no awareness of the storm she had stirred. The door closed. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was dense, pressing against my chest. I sat there for a long while, tracing the rim of my coffee cup with my thumb, listening to the faint tick of the clock in the hallway. This house had been my fortress, my witness, my proof. And now, in my own living room, my daughter had casually proposed dismantling it. I stood and walked through the rooms. My footsteps sounded different that day, heavier, more deliberate. Every corner, every object, seemed to whisper its own memory. This was the dining table where Emily learned to tie her shoes. This was the hallway where we measured her height year after year in pencil marks that still faintly showed. This was the bedroom where I had held my wife's hand through sleepless nights. None of it had a price tag. Yet to her, it was all equity. By the time I returned to my chair, the light in the room had shifted. Evening was beginning to press at the windows. I realized then that this was not about money. It was about erasure of roots, of identity, of a lifetime's work. If I gave this up, I wouldn't just lose a house. I would lose the anchor that had kept me steady through every storm. I sat in the fading light, remembering the first time I stepped through the front door decades ago, holding the keys with hands that shook, not from age, but from the weight of what it meant. I had stood in the empty living room then, imagining laughter filling it, holidays, quiet mornings. Every one of those visions had come true. And now, my daughter was asking me to trade all of that in for a check she and Mark could deposit. I remembered how, after her mother passed, I had kept this place not just for myself, but for Emily, so she would always have a home to return to. I thought of the times she did come back, after heartbreaks or setbacks, and how I had made her favorite soup. Left the porch light on, never once mentioning rent or repayment. This house had been her safety net, and now she was suggesting I cut it apart for her benefit. As I looked at the framed photographs lining the mantel, I understood something. She didn't see the history in this place anymore. She saw potential for herself. And maybe that was the part that hurt most, the realization that somewhere along the line, our definitions of home had split. I let my gaze drift to the window. Outside, the yard was quiet, the oak tree casting long shadows. I could almost hear the echoes of Emily's laughter from years ago, the sound of her running barefoot through the grass. Those memories were not just in my head. They were in the bricks, in the wood, in the very air of this place. Selling it would be like selling a part of myself I could never get back. I walked into the kitchen and ran my hand over the counter, remembering the time she baked her first cake here, how the flour had covered half the floor and the cake itself had collapsed in the middle. Yet she had laughed as though it was perfect. I thought of Christmas mornings, of birthdays, of late-night talks at this very table when she was uncertain about her future. Those moments couldn't be boxed up or sold. And in that quiet, I felt the first threads of resolve pull tight inside me. I didn't know the exact path I'd take, but I knew I wouldn't let this go the way she imagined. If she believed my life's work could be signed away as easily as a dinner receipt, she had forgotten who I was. And I was about to remind her, in a way she would never forget. After she left, I remained seated, the quiet now so thick I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. It was a sound I had never noticed before, a low and constant vibration, like the background noise of my life that I had tuned out for decades. That day, it felt louder, as though it were trying to fill the space her absence had left. I rose and wandered into the hallway, letting my hand drift over the old wallpaper. Tiny floral patterns faded with time. The paper was peeling in the corner near the doorframe, and I remembered how her mother had wanted to replace it years ago. But we never did, because Emily had drawn a tiny heart there with a red crayon when she was 6. We left it as it was, a hidden keepsake, because her mother said, It's part of the house now. And in a way, so was everything we had ever been. I thought about the winters when the furnace struggled to keep up, and we all gathered in the living room under blankets, drinking hot cocoa and telling stories until we dozed off. I thought about the springs when the yard burst into bloom and Emily would run out barefoot, insisting she could smell the lilacs before they even opened. These weren't just memories. They were proof that life had been lived fully here. I walked into my study and sat at the desk, the wood polished smooth by years of my elbows resting there. From the top drawer, I pulled out a stack of old photographs, Emily's first day of school, her high school prom, the day she graduated from college. Her smile in those photos was unguarded, pure, nothing like the measured look she had given me today. I traced the edges of one picture, wondering when exactly we had crossed the invisible bridge from gratitude to expectation. Outside, the sky had deepened to a muted violet. The street lamps flickered on, casting long cones of light that stretched across the lawn. I could hear the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking, a reminder that the world went on, even when mine felt like it had shifted entirely. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. Instead, I would sit in this chair, let the shadows move across the walls, and think about the next step. Because something had changed, not just in her, but in me. I would not beg to keep what was mine. And I would not allow my life's worth to be measured in square footage and market value. She thought this conversation was the beginning of her plan. She was wrong. It was the beginning of mine. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the conversation from the day before replayed, word for word. Her tone was steady, almost casual, as if asking me to sell my home and give her the money was a reasonable, even logical request. But underneath that calm delivery was something deliberate. This wasn't an idea born over a cup of coffee. This was a plan, carefully considered, quietly nurtured, and finally brought to life when she thought the timing was right. In the hours after, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, letting the darkness pull at old memories. For years there had been moments, tiny, almost invisible, when something about her words or actions didn't quite fit the image of the daughter I thought I knew. I had brushed them aside, telling myself I was being unfair, that perhaps she was tired or distracted. But now, those moments aligned like pieces of a puzzle, and the image they revealed was something I could no longer ignore. I remembered the first Christmas she brought Mark over, long before they were married. He had been polite, even charming, but there was an intensity in the way his eyes moved through the house. Not the gaze of someone admiring the photographs on the walls or the memories in the furniture, but the quick, sweeping calculation of someone assessing value. I told myself he was impressed. Now I see that he was evaluating. Over the years, there were small remarks. She would tell stories about friends whose parents had helped them get started by gifting property or large sums of money. She delivered these stories lightly, almost absent-mindedly, but always with a glance in my direction. Brief, but enough to make me wonder. I never responded, and she never pressed. At least, not until now. The hints grew sharper last winter. Mark began to comment openly about the prime location of my home. "You could make a fortune selling this place," he said once, walking through the living room as though already envisioning the listing photos. "You could downsize, make life easier, maybe even travel more." He smiled as if offering a gift, but his eyes told a different story. It was the morning after her request when the true weight of it settled over me. This house wasn't simply an asset. It was the foundation of our family's history. It was where she had taken her first steps, where we'd celebrated birthdays, where her mother had filled the air with the smell of Sunday dinners. Every wall held echoes of laughter and arguments, of life lived fully. By asking me to sell it, she wasn't just asking for bricks and wood. She was asking for the demolition of a lifetime. I thought back to the rainy afternoon when she was 10. She had been running down the hallway in socks, slipped, and burst into tears. I scooped her up, holding her until her sobs quieted, telling her she would always be safe here. The memory hit me hard. How could the same child who once clung to me in this house now be the woman suggesting I give it up? The more I replayed our conversation, the more I understood that this wasn't just about the house. It was about control. Mark's influence was woven into her words. He let her lead the conversation, but his presence was there. Silent, calculated. He was the strategist, she the messenger. They cloaked their intentions in the language of care. They spoke of how much upkeep a large house required, of how lonely it must feel since her mother's passing. But beneath those words was a steady pull toward the outcome they wanted. I started to notice details I had ignored before. The way she would look around the house during visits, eyes lingering on certain pieces of furniture, certain corners. The way conversations would loop back to the future, her future, not mine. One day, while sipping coffee in the kitchen, she remarked softly, "It's such a big place for just you. What if something happened?" At the time, I thought she was just concerned. Now, I hear the subtext clearly. The betrayal was not loud. Didn't crash into the room. It seeped in quietly, like a slow leak in the ceiling, unnoticed until the damage had spread too far. If she had come to me openly, told me they were struggling and needed help, perhaps I would have listened. But this was manipulation in its purest form. I thought about the months after her mother's funeral. In the beginning, she came often, bringing meals, sitting with me through long evenings. But soon the visits shortened. She spent more time scrolling through her phone than talking. And slowly, the comments began about the size of the house, about how much work it must be for me to maintain it alone. I wondered how much of this was her own idea and how much was planted by Mark. He had always been polite, but there was a certain detachment in his politeness, like a man playing a part. When I mentioned feeling tired once, I caught a flicker in his eyes, calculation, not concern. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money, they could have it all, and I'd still have my dignity. What cut deepest was the understanding that she was willing to erase the physical anchor of our family's history for personal gain. For the rest of that week, I kept my thoughts to myself. I listened as she called to check in, always steering the conversation back to what we talked about. Mark added small details, how quickly houses in the neighborhood were selling, how much higher prices had climbed. They thought they were being subtle, but I heard every word for what it was. The more confident they became, the less careful they were. And the less careful they were, the easier it became to see the full scope of their plan. This wasn't just about my home. It was about everything I owned, everything I'd worked for. They were already envisioning a future where my life's work was theirs to claim. That realization hardened something in me. It was not rage, it was resolve. I knew that I could not confront them yet. Any sign of resistance would push them to hide their intentions more carefully. Instead, I would let them believe they were winning me over. I would nod in the right places, smile when appropriate. I would play the part of the aging father, hesitant but persuadable. Because sometimes, the best way to protect what's yours is to let others believe they already have it, until the moment you choose to show them just how wrong they are. From the moment I realized their intentions, I knew the only way forward was not with loud defiance, but with deliberate, calculated silence. I had been a man of straightforward words my entire life. Honesty was the foundation of every friendship, every business deal, every bond I valued. But this was different. This was not a time for blunt truths. This was a time to move like water, silent, adaptable, carving its own path without warning. The decision did not come easily. For days, I wrestled with myself. Part of me wanted to confront them directly, to strip away the polite masks they wore and demand answers. But every time I imagined that confrontation, I saw how it would play into their hands. They would retreat, regroup, and return with a sharper, more subtle plan. No. If I wanted to truly protect what mattered, I had to keep my thoughts hidden, my expression calm, and my movements almost invisible. I began to watch them more closely. Every conversation with Emily became a study in subtext. Her voice, her phrasing, even the pauses between her words revealed more than she realized. When she spoke of how much easier life would be if I downsized, I saw the flicker of anticipation in her eyes. When she mentioned, "The market is perfect for selling," her gaze would shift ever so slightly toward Mark, as if seeking silent confirmation. Mark, for his part, was easier to read. His confidence betrayed him. When he thought he was persuading me, his shoulders would relax, his tone soften. When he sensed hesitation, there was a tightening in his jaw, a faint narrowing of his eyes before the smile returned. My mask was one of mild agreement. I let them believe they were planting seeds. A nod here, a thoughtful hum there. Never a direct yes, but never an outright no. I wanted them to believe they were making progress, that their plan was slowly taking root. Behind this facade, I worked. My first step was to take full stock of everything I owned: properties, accounts, investments, even personal keepsakes. I listed not only their value, but their history. Which ones were bought with my late wife, which ones were tied to family milestones, which carried the weight of memory. This was more than a financial inventory. It was a map of what I could not allow to be taken. Once I had this map, I reached out to Daniel Reed, an old friend and a lawyer whose integrity I trusted beyond question. We met under the guise of updating my will. Over coffee in his quiet office, I floated hypothetical scenarios about family pressure and asset protection. Daniel listened without interruption, his eyes narrowing slightly, though he didn't press for details. He spoke instead about legal structures, trusts, conditional transfers, clauses that could prevent anyone from accessing my estate through coercion. That conversation became the backbone of my plan. Quietly, Daniel began to help me restructure things. Some properties were placed under protective trusts with stipulations only I could fulfill. Certain accounts required multiple forms of authentication that only I controlled. Every change was designed to be invisible to anyone not looking for it. At home, I moved important documents from my study safe to a deposit box in a bank 3 towns over, a place with no ties to our neighborhood, where Mark would never think to look. I changed passwords, updated security questions, and began storing digital backups in encrypted drives hidden in plain sight. I also began a journal, not for sentiment, but for evidence. Every conversation with Emily and Mark was documented in detail, complete with dates and exact phrasing. If the day came when I needed to prove their intentions, I would have an unshakable record. All the while, I thought about Emily, not as the woman sitting across from me now, but as the little girl who used to run down the hallway, her laughter echoing against the walls. Part of me still hoped that by moving carefully, I could shield her from making a mistake she could never undo. I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted to protect her from the consequences of being led astray. My plan formed in layers. The outer layer was what they saw. a father slowly coming around to their way of thinking. The next layer was the legal and financial armor Daniel was helping me build. The innermost layer was mine alone, a timeline of actions that would tighten control over my estate without their knowledge. I also understood the value of appearances. I began reaching out to old friends, attending small gatherings, rekindling connections. An isolated man is easy to corner. A man with visible ties to others is far harder to pressure. I wanted them to see that I was not as alone as they might have believed. Weeks passed, and I kept my role. Emily's calls became more frequent, her tone more confident. Mark began to speak more openly about our future plans, as if my compliance was already secured. Their growing certainty was my greatest advantage. The more they believed they were winning, the less guarded they became. Still, there were moments when the urge to act immediately nearly overwhelmed me. But each time, I reminded myself, patience is its own kind of weapon. A plan revealed too early can be dismantled. A plan revealed at the right moment is unstoppable. Every night, as I locked my journal and double-checked the files I had hidden, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. I was no longer reacting to them. I was shaping the outcome. And when the time came to act, I would do so from a position of absolute control, ensuring they would never again mistake my patience for weakness. In the quiet hours before dawn, I often sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, staring at the faint glow of the streetlights outside. It was in these moments that my mind would replay the chain of events that had brought me here. I thought of the family dinners that used to fill this house with laughter, of Emily helping her mother in the kitchen, of the pride I felt watching her graduate and step into the world. Those memories were sharp contrasts to the subtle manipulations I now faced. This contrast only strengthened my resolve. I realized that my plan wasn't only about protecting my assets. It was about reclaiming the dignity of our relationship. I could not stop Emily from making her choices, but I could ensure that those choices would not be built upon my undoing. I refined my layers of defense with almost surgical precision. The legal safeguards became more complex, with provisions that would activate automatically if certain conditions were met. I even prepared a secondary will, one that would remain sealed unless tampering was detected in my primary one. These were the invisible walls I was building, brick by brick, while presenting nothing more than a polite smile on the surface. Socially, I expanded my circle further. I joined a local historical society, began attending charity events, and made a point of being seen in the company of trusted friends. It was subtle, but intentional. Each interaction another strand in a web of perception. If anyone tried to paint me as vulnerable or incapable, there would now be many voices to challenge that narrative. Every piece of this plan was designed for one purpose: control. And as I moved each part into place, I began to feel the shift, not in them, but in me. I was no longer the man reacting to circumstances. I was the one setting the stage. The day would come when my patience would end, when the walls would close in, and not with anger, but with quiet finality. When that day arrived, there would be no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, only the calm unveiling of a truth they had never suspected. They would see, with absolute clarity, that every step they had taken toward my downfall had been met with a step of my own, one they never saw coming. Justice, I realized, does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives in silence, steady, deliberate, unshakable. The waiting was over. For weeks, I had moved like a shadow in my own home, careful not to disturb the delicate illusion I had built around Emily and Mark. Now, the pieces were all in place. Every document had been shifted, every account fortified, every legal safeguard activated. There was nothing left to prepare, only to act. The morning it began was unremarkable to anyone else. I brewed my coffee, read the paper, and exchanged a few polite words with Emily over the phone. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed victory was near. I kept my tone light, even warm, masking the undercurrent of finality in my voice. The first step was subtle. I authorized the final transfer of assets into the trust Daniel and I had built. It was a fortress now, its walls invisible but impenetrable, with clauses that would trigger the moment anyone attempted to interfere. I didn't need to announce this move. It was already sealed in the quiet language of legal code. Next, I contacted the real estate agent handling a small property I owned across town. To Emily and Mark, it was an insignificant place, barely worth their attention. In reality, it was the key to another layer of my plan. The sale would generate liquid capital that could be moved instantly into secure holdings outside their reach. No one questioned it. Why would they? On the surface, I was simply downsizing. The most delicate part of the plan involved the company shares, assets they didn't even realize I still controlled. Through a trusted intermediary, I began the process of shifting those shares into a holding entity under my sole management. There would be no public record linking the two until the process was complete. By the time they discovered it, the paper trail would be cold. All the while, my outward life remained unchanged. I attended community events, visited old friends, and even invited Emily and Mark over for dinner one Sunday. We ate roast chicken at the dining table, the same one my wife and I had bought when Emily was born. They laughed, told stories, and never noticed the faint smile I wore. Not one of affection alone, but of quiet satisfaction. Mark spoke about new opportunities and big plans, clearly imagining himself at the center of them. I nodded, offering just enough enthusiasm to keep him talking. Every word he spoke was another confirmation that I was right to act. Behind the scenes, more pieces moved. A long-forgotten cabin in the hills was transferred into a trust for my grandson's future. An art collection, modest in appearance but valuable to the right buyer, was moved to a secure storage facility. Each action was deliberate, each one timed to avoid detection. Daniel and I met twice during this period, always in neutral locations. We spoke in low voices, going over contingencies and timelines. He understood the stakes, not only for my financial security, but for the integrity of my family's history. Every clause, every restriction, every delayed release condition was crafted with precision. Then came the day to finalize the most critical document, a letter of intent that, in the event of my passing, would outline the truth. Not just the legal truth, but the moral one. It would detail the choices I had made, the reasons behind them, and the warning I hoped Emily would one day understand. When the ink dried on that letter, I felt a shift. This was no longer a plan in motion. It was a plan completed. All that remained was to let them continue believing in their own narrative until the moment it collapsed. The collapse, when it came, would not be loud. It would be a series of locked doors where they expected open ones, of phone calls that ended in polite refusals, of legal notices they could not undo. There would be no shouting, no gloating, only the steady weight of reality settling in. In the evenings, I found myself walking through the house, running my hand along the walls, the furniture, the photographs. This was my life's work, my family's story etched into every corner. Protecting it was not just about money. It was about honoring the years, the sacrifices, the love that had built it. I knew the day was close when Mark grew bolder, speaking in terms of when rather than if. Emily, too, began to assume decisions had already been made. They were so certain, so assured, that they stopped looking for signs of resistance. That was the beauty of it. My silence had not only protected my plan, It had made it invisible. By the time they realized what I had done, the game would already be over. And when that day arrived, I would be ready, not with anger or triumph, but with the calm satisfaction of knowing that I had defended what mattered most. Justice, in its quietest form, is still justice. And sometimes, it is all the more powerful for arriving without a sound. In those last quiet days before the storm, I often sat on the porch at dusk, the setting sun painting the sky in muted gold. I would listen to the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, the world moving on around me. It was a reminder that life was more than the schemes of a few ambitious individuals. And it gave me peace to know that when the truth surfaced, it would stand unshaken by time or circumstance. Everything was ready. The silent action had been completed. All that remained was for the world, and for Emily and Mark, to discover it, step by inevitable step. The night before the final stage of my plan unfolded, I allowed myself a single glass of aged whiskey. It wasn't to celebrate, not yet, but to acknowledge the years of patience that had brought me to this point. I sat in the dim light of my study, the amber liquid warm in my hand, and thought about all the conversations I had endured without revealing a single card. It was remarkable how much people said when they believed you had nothing to hide. I remembered each time Mark dropped a careless hint about his intentions, each time Emily shifted the conversation toward my property or finances. I had nodded, smiled, even offered bits of information, carefully chosen, of course, to keep them thinking they were leading the game. In truth, every moment had been another turn of the key in a lock they would never open. My phone buzzed once. Daniel, confirming that the final trust documents were filed. It was done. Even if I were to vanish tomorrow, every measure we had put in place would stand. The shares, the properties, the assets. They were now guarded by structures so tight and complex that even the most determined hand could not pry them loose. Still, I understood that the coming days would be the most delicate. I had to act as if nothing had changed, to move through my routine with the same quiet dignity I always had. There could be no victory lap, no sign that anything had been concluded. The strength of my plan lay not only in its design, but in its invisibility. On Sunday, Emily called to suggest another family dinner. Her tone was unusually warm, almost casual. I accepted, already knowing that the warmth was just another mask, one I had learned to see through long ago. We ate, we laughed, we reminisced about old vacations and milestones. I watched her carefully, noting the ease with which she moved through the evening, unaware that the ground beneath her had already shifted. In the days that followed, I finalized a few quiet transactions, selling a small parcel of land, moving the proceeds into accounts outside their knowledge, securing a few personal heirlooms in a private vault. Each step was small, almost invisible on its own, but together they formed the final weave of a net that would hold firm when the time came. I often thought about the difference between winning and surviving. Surviving meant keeping what you had. Winning meant ensuring no one could take it from you again. I was no longer merely surviving. When the last document was sealed, I felt a stillness settle over me. It wasn't joy exactly, nor was it relief. It was something deeper, a quiet certainty that I had done everything within my power to protect what mattered. The rest would unfold naturally, as all things do when the foundation is strong. In the end, my greatest weapon had not been wealth or legal power. It had been patience. And patience, I had learned, was the one thing my opponents could never imitate. The storm had passed. In the quiet weeks that followed, I began to understand the full weight of what had happened, not in the noise of confrontation, but in the absence of it. Emily and Mark no longer called with demands or subtle manipulations. There were no unexpected visits, no urgent paperwork slid across my desk. The silence itself had become the final verdict. I moved through my home differently now. The rooms no longer felt like contested ground, each hallway a place where I braced for intrusion. Instead, they felt whole again, mine in every sense. The photographs on the walls were no longer evidence to be defended, but memories to be enjoyed. Daniel came by one afternoon, carrying the final set of legal documents. We sat in the kitchen, the late winter sun slanting across the table, and he said simply, "It's done. They can't touch anything now." His tone wasn't triumphant. It was certain. The kind of certainty that comes when every possible angle has been considered. I thought about what I had been protecting all along. It wasn't the money, not really. Wealth was only a tool. What I truly fought for was the integrity of my life's work. The decades of effort, sacrifice, and choices that built what I had. To let it slip away would have been to erase the very proof of my existence. Now that the defense was complete, the question became, what do I leave behind? I started looking at my possessions differently. The cabin in the hills, once hidden for safety, could now become a summer retreat for my grandson. The art collection, protected during the chaos, was cataloged with notes, where each piece came from, why it mattered. Even this old house, with its worn floors and creaking steps, was more than a place to live. It was a living record of my family's story. One evening, I began writing letters, not legal instructions, but personal messages to be read in the years to come. Some were for my grandson, offering small pieces of advice I wish I had known at his age. Others were for Emily. I didn't know if she would ever read them, but they held truths she might one day need to hear. They weren't accusations. They were explanations. Renewal came slowly. I started walking in the park each morning, greeting familiar faces I'd ignored while I was consumed by the conflict. I rejoined the community board, not because I needed influence, but because I wanted to be part of building something again. For so long, my energy had gone into holding the line. Now, I could move forward. People noticed the change. Margaret, an old friend, stopped me one day and said, "You seem lighter." She was right. The constant tension, the readiness to defend myself, was gone. In its place was something steadier, more hopeful. There were still moments when the past tried to pull me back. A stray phrase, a familiar smell, a memory of raised voices in the hall. But each time, I reminded myself, I had survived. And not only survived, I had kept the essence of who I was intact. Protecting my assets had been about more than keeping them away from Emily and Mark. It was about ensuring that I could decide how they would shape the future. Now, I could fund scholarships, restore the library, support causes that mattered to me, not as a show of power, but as an act of purpose. The greatest change, though, was internal. For the first time in years, the horizon looked open. My legacy wasn't just the tangible things I would leave behind. It was the example I set by standing my ground without losing my humanity. When I thought of Emily now, I felt both grief and hope. Grief for what we had lost. Hope that, with time, there might be some kind of understanding. Whether that happened or not, my life would continue, restored, not diminished. Justice had come quietly, without spectacle. My legacy was secured. And in that quiet, I found my own resurrection. The storm had taken much from me, but it had also left me with something unexpected. Clarity. The clarity to see what mattered most, and the strength to protect it without becoming hardened or bitter. That I realized, was the truest inheritance I could ever pass on. In the days that followed, I allowed myself the rare luxury of slowing down. I lingered over coffee in the mornings, reading the paper from front to back. I found myself taking longer routes home simply to pass by the places that reminded me of a simpler time: bookshops, small cafes, the quiet bench by the river. These were things I had forgotten to enjoy in the years I spent defending myself. The cabin in the hills became my weekend refuge. I began repairs that I had postponed for too long, replacing the loose steps on the porch, sanding down the worn table where so many family meals had been shared. I imagined my grandson running through the grass, chasing fireflies the way I had when I was his age. The thought filled me with a warmth that all the legal victories in the world could never provide. I also reached out to people I had lost touch with, old friends who had been kept at a distance while I fought my Evans. Private war began to reappear in my life. We shared meals, stories, and sometimes long silences that felt just as healing as any words. I realized then that protecting my legacy was not just about securing my assets. It was about ensuring I had something worth sharing with the people I cared about. Still, I could not deny the quiet ache that remained when I thought of Emily. The betrayal had cut deep, and though I had shielded myself from the worst of its consequences, the wound itself would take time to heal. There were moments when I imagined us sitting together again, speaking openly, as father and daughter should. Whether that day would come, I could not say. But I left the door open in my heart, even if I had locked the doors to my estate. One evening, as I looked over the city from my study window, I felt the kind of peace that comes not from forgetting what happened, but from knowing you have endured it. My story was not one of vengeance, though justice had been served. It was a story of preservation, of holding on to what mattered most when everything around you seemed determined to take it away. I began to document the journey, not for the public, but for myself and for those who might one day face similar trials. The pages were filled not only with strategies and legal safeguards, but with the emotional truths I had learned. That young strength is often quiet, that patience is a sharper weapon than anger, and that the surest victories are the ones won without fanfare. The final act of renewal came when I established a charitable trust in my late wife's name. It would support education, the arts, and community projects, causes we had both believed in deeply. In doing so, I ensured that a part of her spirit and of mine would continue to shape the world long after we were gone. And so, the days moved forward, not with the frantic pace of conflict, but with the steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. I had not just survived the storm, I had rebuilt in its wake. My legacy was intact, my future was my own, and the lessons I had learned would guide me for whatever lay ahead. The house was quiet now, but it was the kind of quiet that felt alive. It was the sound of freedom, the absence of fear, the presence of possibility. And in that quiet, I finally understood. The greatest inheritance I could leave was not the property, or the wealth, or even the name. It was the example that no matter how deep the betrayal, there is always a way back to yourself. In the weeks that followed, I began to see my home and my life through a new lens. The rooms no longer felt like battlegrounds. They were living archives, each corner holding the scent, the texture, the quiet hum of decades. I found myself pausing in doorways, running my fingers along the familiar grooves in the banister, or lingering in the kitchen just to hear the kettle whistle the way it had for years. These were sounds and sensations I had once taken for granted. Now, they felt like small treasures. I started keeping the porch light on in the evenings again, not because I was waiting for Emily to come by, though a part of me still held that hope, but because I liked the way its glow spilled onto the walkway, softening the night. It reminded me of when her mother and I would sit out there, talking until the crickets grew quiet, watching our daughter's shadow dance across the lawn as she played. The cabin in the hills became more than a project. It was a place where my mind could rest without the faint tension that had lived in me for too long. I repaired the screen door, fixed the creak in the floorboards, and planted a row of sunflowers just beyond the porch. Their bright, stubborn heads turned toward the sun no matter what the weather had been the day before. I liked that about them, the refusal to dwell on storms. Old friendships deepened. Daniel and I began meeting for lunch once a week, no longer to discuss legal strategies, but to swap stories from our youth. I reconnected with Margaret, who had known my wife in college, and we started attending local gallery openings together. In those moments, I realized something important. Guarding your life's work doesn't mean locking yourself away from the world. It means choosing carefully who you let in. One afternoon, I found a box I hadn't opened in years, tucked high on a closet shelf. Inside were letters, handwritten ones, from my wife. Some were short notes she had slipped into my coat pocket before work. Others were longer, sent during the early years when we were apart for business. I read them slowly, hearing her voice in every loop and flourish of ink. It struck me that, while money could be fought over, these words could not be claimed by anyone but me. They were mine, and they were priceless. The betrayal from Emily and Mark still sat in my chest like an unhealed bruise, but I began to understand that healing wouldn't come from their apology, if it ever came, but from how I chose to live now. I could not rewrite their actions, but I could decide that my days would no longer be shaped by them. That was its own kind of power. I also found myself drawn to the idea of passing on something more than material wealth. I began teaching a free Saturday workshop at the community center, helping young people learn basic financial literacy, how to read contracts, understand loans, and avoid the kind of traps that can strip away years of hard work. The first day, only 6 people showed up. By the third week, there were 20, notebooks open, questions ready. Watching their eyes light up when they grasped a concept made me feel that perhaps the best use of my experience was to arm others against the same kind of quiet exploitation I had faced. One evening, while preparing dinner, I caught myself setting an extra place at the table out of habit. I stood there, looking at the empty chair. Once, that sight would have hollowed me out. Now, I simply smiled, thinking that life has seasons, some full, some quiet, and both have their own kind of beauty. I did not hear from Emily for months, though I knew through the small-town grapevine that she and Mark had been pursuing other opportunities. Part of me wondered if they had guessed the extent of what I'd done, or if they still believed I might change my mind. Either way, I no longer felt the need to brace myself for their calls. Instead, I looked forward to the spring planting at the cabin, to the art auction I'd agreed to help organize, to the letter I was writing for my grandson's 18th birthday. It contained no lectures, no warnings, just stories about the kind of man his grandfather had tried to be. A man who had loved deeply, worked honestly, and, when tested, had stood quietly but firmly in defense of what was right. I often think about how easy it would have been to take the other path, to sell the house, to hand over the proceeds, to convince myself that it was helping. But I know now that help given at the cost of your own foundation is no help at all. It's surrender. And surrender is a debt that keeps collecting interest. On the first truly warm day of spring, I opened every window in the house. The air rushed in, carrying the scent of blooming lilacs from the yard. I stood there for a moment, letting it wash over me. This was still my home. These were still my walls, my floors, my history. and as long as I drew breath, they would stand not as a monument to resistance, but as a testament to endurance. When I think about the legacy I'll leave behind, I no longer measure it in square footage or account balances. I measure it in the lives touched by what I've built, whether through a trust in my wife's name, a workshop that teaches someone how to protect their own future, or a story like this one, told to someone who might one day need the reminder that their worth is not up for negotiation. The betrayal had been a storm, yes, but storms, for all their destruction, also clear the air. And in the clarity that follows, you can see further than you ever did before. And so, I move forward, not bitter, not naive, but certain that my life is my own, that my legacy will remain intact, and that no quiet scheme can uproot a man who has learned the art of standing still until the ground beneath him is unshakable. Since the day that storm passed, I've allowed myself to slow down. Every morning, I brew a full pot of coffee and sit at the dining table, watching sunlight slip through the curtains, casting warm golden streaks across the wall. The ticking of the wall clock is the same as always, but I hear it differently now, no longer with tension, no longer bracing for whatever might come. I spend more time in the garden. The flower beds I used to pass by without a glance have become my morning stop. I bend down, lightly touching each petal, as if to confirm that beauty still exists, regardless of human schemes. The spring breeze carries the scent of damp earth and wild blossoms, reminding me that life's cycles continue, and renewal always begins in silence. Sometimes, sitting on the long bench out on the porch, I remember Emily as a child, hair flying wild, small feet racing across the yard, laughter ringing endlessly. I wonder, if she were to return one day, would I see her through the eyes of the father I once was, or would I still see the shadow of the woman who once put her own interests above every shared memory? I don't yet know the answer, but I know I'm ready to listen if that day comes. I've also begun to plan for the years ahead, not to accumulate more, but to enjoy and to give. I want to turn the cabin in the hills into a refuge for those who need to step away from the noise of life. Perhaps a writer seeking inspiration, a veteran learning to find his rhythm again, or simply someone in need of a quiet space. The idea excites me, as though I'm still building, but this time for the soul. In the evenings, I turn on the old radio, letting the songs my wife once loved fill the house. The music blends with the rustle of leaves outside the window, creating a simple harmony that's enough to fill the emptiness. I realize that happiness doesn't have to come from grand gestures. Sometimes, it's just a familiar melody in a quiet home. I no longer expect life to give back what I've lost. Instead, I've learned to value what I've kept. My peace, my intact memories, and the right to choose my own path. In the end, those are the things no one can take away. And when I look out from the porch on a late afternoon, the sun sinking behind the trees, I understand that my story doesn't end in loss. It ends in choice, the choice to hold on to who I am and to keep living in a way that allows me to smile, even when no one is there to see it. And so, the days move on. Steady, unhurried. Each sunrise feels like a small promise, and each evening like a quiet reward. What once felt like an ending now feels like the gentle beginning of something entirely my own. I walk through my home without the weight of fear, pausing to touch the walls, to let the light spill across the floors, to breathe in the scent of the garden drifting through open windows. I don't know exactly where the road ahead will lead, but I do know this. I will walk it on my own terms, with my head held high, carrying the lessons that cost me dearly, lessons in trust, patience, and the unshakable strength to protect what matters. These lessons will guide me through every season still to come, and remind me, always, that my worth is not for others to decide. Thank you for staying with me until the very last moments of this story. If today's story touched you, take a second to hit the like button. It lets me know you want to hear more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the emotional journeys coming up. And I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below to share your feelings or even your own story. Who knows? The next story might begin with the very words you write today.